Hi, I'm Terri Markham, Executive Director of Uprising. I am joined today with my pal, Joseph Scaramucci. He is a detective down in Waco, Texas for McLennan County Sheriff's Office, right? Did I say it right?
That's it. You got it.
All right. So Joe's joining us today so that we can have a conversation surrounding sex buyers. Really fun topic. And I asked Joe to take part in this today because we actually just wrapped up a weeks-long training in Sweetwater County where Joe was able to train several law enforcement agents from around our state on advanced human trafficking investigations. And it culminated in an operation where 4 buyers were arrested. And what I'm seeing in our state after this news broke is lots of questions and people who maybe don't understand how someone purchasing sex relates to human trafficking. So I wanted to have you on, ask you some questions. Let's start with, can you just tell us a little bit more about human trafficking investigations and your sort of unique approach to it?
Yeah. So when we talk about the actual investigations themselves, without divulging the secrets of the trade, so generally what's done in law enforcement is to conduct prostitution operations, go out, find the sellers of sex, which are typically trafficking victims, arrest them, kind of try to get them to flip for us, tell me about their pimp, whatever. Statistically, that's failing miserably. It's not getting anywhere. It's just kind of a waste of time and resources. So what we do is target kind of two-pronged. One end of that prong is the traffickers. So we do our operations to target specifically the traffickers. And in the process of that, working with non-governmental organizations like yourself, who can then help the trafficking survivor. So we have that prong where we're, running hard and fast after the traffickers, which is really my favorite part because they need to go to prison. But then the other part is the demand side, right? So what's actually fueling the sex trade? What is fueling human trafficking? And it's demand for sex for purchase. So we try to remove the trafficker from that equation and the person who's buying from that equation, and then ultimately get some restoration and recovery for the victim who's stuck in the middle.
Yeah. So that's awesome. We obviously, on our operation last week, buyers were targeted. So tell me a little bit more, dive in a little bit deeper about why we do an operation targeting buyers. What good does that do in the world for us?
Yeah, so I mean, let's look at where we were, right? We're in Rock Springs, Wyoming. Population 23,000, I think it was. The nearest city that you can even post a sex ad is roughly 2.5 hours away. That's where our ads were placed, right? In Salt Lake City, Utah. So when we look at how trafficking occurs, supply and demand, right? That's all it is at the end of the day. And I always, and I don't want to sound harsh, but I try to look at victims are a commodity, right? So I ask people, think about a gallon of milk. If I'm in Rock Springs and I can buy a gallon of milk in Rock Springs, why in God's name would I drive to Salt Lake City to buy the same gallon of milk? I'm just going to buy it here. So introducing the fact that a potential victim is quite literally in Rock Springs opens the door for the buyers that are already purchasing, right? These guys are already doing it. I think when we talked to them, every single one of them admitted that they had done this before. It's not like you just one day mysteriously know how to purchase sex. The reason why that's so important is kind of multi-pronged, but there's a study that was conducted by Dr. Melissa Farley that has basically said that 84%-ish of prostitution is actually third-party controlled, right? So 84% of our potential sex workers are literally third-party control, which would be what we call a pimp, a trafficker, or anything like that. Dr. Angela Henderson, who was out with us, did her studies as well. That was showing that basically 95% of the women that were involved in prostitution felt it was necessary to their basic survival, having their needs met, and that had they been provided meaningful services, that they would exit the sex trade. So when we look at that, we're roughly between 84 and 95% of the people involved in this are not consensual. It's not what they choose to be doing. And the reason why we have to target demand is because those roughly 84 to 90%, 95% are not coming to law enforcement. They're not reaching out, right? We have force, fraud, coercion, all the reasons why they don't. Stockholm syndrome, learned helplessness. I mean, all the things we could talk about that hinder that, very, very, very similarly to a domestic violence victim. So we have to look at what we're actually investigating, and we're investigating forced rape. That's what we're investigating. The buyers, between 84 and 95% of the time, whether they know it or not, are participating in forced rape.
Yeah, so I mean, that's exactly addresses what I was seeing a lot of. There were tons of comments that I was seeing on social media where people were like, wait, these are two consensual adults. And so why are we spending our time on this? I even saw one comment where someone was like, this is entrapment. Probably a buyer.
So here's the thing, and let's talk about entrapment, right? This is where I think people who are ignorant to the law and they suddenly learn law. Entrapment is that I made you do something that you would normally not do, right? That would be me getting on random numbers in Rock Springs and messaging them and somehow convincing them that they should come purchase sex. We didn't do anything. We opened the door and these guys walked through it, right? All we did was say, hey, these are the same ads you're answering already in Salt Lake City. We know that because you admitted to it. We're just saying, here we are in Rock Springs, and they're the ones that are doing that. That's not entrapment. That's allowing somebody to do what they normally do, and that's purchase sex.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think, I don't even know how to ask this question. I'm curious a little bit more, digging into the buyer. Do you see buyers who are reoffending over and over? So is actually doing these operations and arresting them doing any good for them? Or do we see buyers who are changed? Like, what about all that?
We can speak to that in a couple different ways, right? So there was a study that was done by Demand Abolition about sex buyers, right? And basically what they were able to determine that about 6.2% of men, because buyers are primarily men, about 6.2% of men have purchased sex in the last year. 6.2. That's not a ton of men. Of that 6.2, 25% of those account for 75% of the overall purchasing of sex, right? They're high frequency buyers. Those are guys that are purchasing sex all the time. That's really who we're really trying to drive home to. They make up the overwhelming majority of the small fraction of men that actually pay for sex. So when we look at that, of that 6.2% of men that say they buy sex, only 6% have ever been arrested. So 6% of 6.2% have ever been arrested, right? Mm-hmm. What I can tell you is that in my experience, we've arrested at this point in excess of about 470 sex buyers within my jurisdiction alone. Of those 470, I would say it's less than 10 that we've ever caught reoffending. And we also monitor buyer boards. We monitor the phone numbers to see if they're cycling back through. So we can't even argue that, hey, I arrested this person with this phone number, and they're messaging, we just haven't caught them again. If your number comes up again, I'm going to focus on you, right? So we're not even seeing that happen again. It does make a dent. There was actually a study that was done by, I believe, the National Institute of Justice in Jersey City, New Jersey. And they were showing that buyer operations will reduce trafficking by up to 75% in the jurisdiction. So, I mean, that's how important targeting the demand for purchasing sex is.
Yeah, dang. So you mentioned earlier stats kind of about the victims. Let's go back to the victim side. That a huge high percentage of them are likely under control of a third party, are victims. So just to clarify, when you're doing an operation, are you just sort of presuming that any of the sex workers advertising are victims?
course, right? So look at it like this. This is where law enforcement, this is why the training that we conducted there is so important, right? And I think this is where community understanding needs to be important. Sheer numbers. If I were to put 100 women, because primarily it's women that sell or are, the victims of trafficking. We do have men, but we'll say 100 sex sellers, right? We line them all up and we go to try to pick out which ones are consensual and which ones aren't. Quite literally, 84 of those we can just remove from the equation. They're trafficking victims, right? They're likely trafficking victims. There's some differing statistics, but 85 to 89% seems to be about right. So let's take them out. So we literally, in all of this, have 11 left at best, 11 people of the 100 we started with. So now going back to Dr. Henderson's, now let's take out 6 of those. And we have 5 people left. Why are we going to waste our law enforcement efforts on those 5 people, right? Let's say at the end of the day, 5 consensual sex workers. I would challenge you to ask something further. If for the last 5 that remain, they had a chance to stop doing what they're doing and do something else that was of comparable, monetary gain, would they do it? And I guarantee you probably, let's be conservative, 2 of those would say yes. I'm not wasting my time on the other 3. I'm not going to do anything to change your life. If you are legitimately a consensual sex worker and you legitimately just love it, fine. I'm too busy focusing on human traffickers.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that because at the end of the day, it sounds like from a law enforcement perspective, you have a lot more, it's just a lot more effective work actually putting bad guys away when you switch the focus from the person selling sex
totally,
to the person
right?
buying.
But I think that's where the public needs to understand is that when you look at the numbers like we just described, nobody, law enforcement in Wyoming, law enforcement in, any jurisdiction are not focused on those 3 girls. We're focused on the other 97. So we have to walk in with the understanding that this is not wasting resources. We're focusing on the 97, not the final 3.
And just to throw this out there, do you feel that when you are in contact with victims selling sex, do they self-identify as victims?
So I've had, I don't know, I've arrested in excess at this point of 150 traffickers. We've identified in excess of 270 human trafficking victims. And those are ones that I can say, I have probable cause to believe you were a trafficking victim. I have one that is literally going to trial that is like, I'm not a trafficking victim, and we have all the evidence to show that. I would say of those cases, all of those cases, one ran to me and was like, oh my God, I need help. I would say less than 10 that are based on outcry of a victim. So the thought that they're going to come reaching out for help is non-existent. I think statistically speaking, they say that very similar to domestic violence, that your average victim will leave and come back 7 times. That's the one that's done it once and never goes back. And that's the one that's done it 14 times. So they don't self-identify, and the reality is they shouldn't have to. We should be able to identify them for them, whether they want to admit it or not. It's never been anybody's job to identify as the victim of crime. You are or you're not, whether you know it or not.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to ask that question, just to get that nugget of information out there.
Totally.
So what happens if you're running an operation like this and you come into contact with a sex worker, or they bring someone with them or whatever, there's a victim there?
So the way that we operate, in as an example, I don't know all the organizations that were there with us, but everybody was there, right? It was one big group. It's collaboration. It's working together. It's looking at basically what is the collaborative model that's used in child abuse. The first CAC was built in Birmingham, Alabama, I think in 1984, and that model has withstood the test of time. So it's putting all of us together in one room, or two rooms, and then being able to say, look, like, we have our victim, we have this person who needs help. As law enforcement, I'm not a service provider. It's just not what I do. I arrest people, right? I investigate criminal offenses. Service providers do those things. So the goal is really for them to understand that, hey, you're not going to jail. Whether or not you know it, we believe you're a victim of crime. You're going to go over here. You guys do what you do, and we're all going to work together at the same table.
Yeah. So when you're talking about the other people in the room, though, just to clarify, they were victim advocates and NGOs who were there. So that
not law enforcement.
You don't have to do that. You just get to pass them off to people who are trained to deal with that. It makes so much sense.
Yeah. I can assure you that you do not want most law enforcement officers trying to be a victim advocate. That's I don't think by design we're made that way, right?
It makes so much sense. I don't know why people don't follow a model like this in lots of situations. Okay, what else? I think we've covered like almost all my questions. I want to know, for just the general public, if you could help them understand or know one thing about sex buying. Is there something that you're like, I wish every person knew this?
I mean, there's multiple things, right? So we have to look at sex buying. We look at it as this. There's no equality, right? There's not. We can say it's two consenting adults. There's still a hierarchy, period. If I'm paying for you as a human being, I'm paying for your body, you belong to me for this period. That is not equal. We engage in consensual sex acts with people that we're in love with. We do those with people on the same playing field. If I purchase you, we're not. I have the power. I have the control. So there's that dynamic that's going in place too. When you think about law enforcement resources, right? Let's look at the operation that we did. It was during business hours. There's no overtime spent. There's no high speed, data collection that was spent. Every tool that we used in the operation is completely free to law enforcement. Everybody that was there would have been on their Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 anyway, right? So we weren't even wasting resources. We were hopefully in a position where, and I'm familiar with one person that you actually, followed up with us on, that said, after my arrest, I did the research, I did some information digging, and I did find that I'm a huge part of this problem. So if the people that are being arrested for it can say, look, I really screwed up and I contribute to human trafficking, the rest of the public needs to know that as well. And it's, again, going back to simple economics. I didn't see how many car dealerships there were while we were in Rock Springs, but I will say this. I assume there was a Chevy dealership, and I assume there was at least a Ford dealership. If the entire city of Rock Springs quits going to the Chevy dealership to purchase Chevys, they're going out of business, period. They're not going to sustain. So it's the same thing with people. It's just like a vehicle. If you can get them to quit buying that person, it's unsustainable. So it will alleviate the trafficking that's going on in the city of Rock Springs. And by virtue of the fact that 4 men showed up in one day, it is happening there. So it's just getting people to understand that it's not wasting time and resources, it's saving lives. And it does have a bearing when those arrests are made. Going back again to like Jersey City, where they said that NIJ study where they said that targeted operations of buyers will reduce by 75%. You reduce the trafficking going on in Rock Springs by 75%. That's a huge dent. I mean, that's huge. Mm-hmm. So it's just something to be cognizant of, I think.
Yeah, I lied. I have another question because you made me think of something. You mentioned the buyer. I got time for you anytime. You mentioned the buyer, that there was a buyer who came back and made a point to let us know, like, hey, I did end up going and researching human trafficking after I was arrested. And we did something kind of unique, I guess. I don't think it's common, but we did interviews right at the point of arrest. tell me more about that. Like, have you experienced that before? Do you think that you saw a difference when you haven't done interviews at the time of arrest?
Yeah. So yes and no. From the law enforcement side, we always do the interview at time of arrest, right? We're gonna get you in the room. We're gonna sit down. We're gonna talk. I think that there was kind of an interesting dynamic with the ladies from the Avery Center, in letting them sit down and take the time to do research and have the interviews with these men. They were able to talk through a lot more about why they were purchasing sex, which I think is very important because it gives us a glimpse as to why they're even doing this to begin with. So if we can find out why you're doing something, ultimately, hopefully we can end it. But I think it also provided the time for it not to be law enforcement given the old scolding, right? That's what we do as cops. We're like, you should know better. You shouldn't be doing this, blah, blah, blah. And it afforded an opportunity for two people to sit down with these men on a very personal level and explain to them what was occurring, why this matters, what the importance is. And for those men to then get an understanding that wasn't being scolded. So I feel like this was probably one of the most successful operations that I've ever done, even though on a numbers level it was very, it was 4 people. But I think that the meaning behind it, and I think that the opportunity for these men to understand what they were doing was significantly better, and it was very unique. We do allow it on within my agency. But I think that this one just had a much different feel for it. I think kind of to add also, when we look at most of our data surrounding sex buyers, it really exists and comes from like John schools, right? What we call John schools. We call it stop demand school. Everybody has a name for it. And when we look at stop demand schools, primarily to be able to get into it, you can't have any prior convictions for any criminal offenses. You can't be a felon. You can't do all of this stuff. So we're already walking in when we get to stop demand school or buyer school with a dwindled number. And usually those dwindled numbers are very specific demographics of people who can afford it, who, have never had the prior arrests and all that. So we're losing a ton of information because it wasn't at point of arrest. So yeah, I think that's a huge game changer for many, many reasons. And it's definitely something that even I learned from, and I will definitely be pushing for a ton more of that at time of arrest.
Yeah, I'll have to have the Avery Center girls on for an interview next because it was really interesting. Yeah. There were several comments from people on the operation who were surprised. I mean, we had a survivor of human trafficking interviewing these buyers at point of arrest, and they were surprisingly kind to them. They weren't like you said, shaming them. And I was surprised that they all agreed to talk to them and kind of opened up.
Yeah. So. And you could very, very clearly see the dynamic change, right? So you have us in there, we're all invested in looking like the marshmallow man, and we're like, but now we want you to talk to these ladies. And you could see the shift. It may have taken a few minutes on some of them, but it was very clear, and you could watch the I don't know if this is a word, the humanization of it, them humanizing the people that were sitting in front of them. You could see it click. So that was a pretty remarkable thing, I think.
Yeah, it was great. Awesome. Well, thank you for answering some of these questions. Hopefully it helps people who might see this have a little bit more understanding to the reasoning behind what we did. I think you did excellent work. Yeah. And that's
your troops up there. You guys have amazing law enforcement. They did it. We just kind of stood around and helped. So big, huge kudos to them because they really crushed it more than anybody.
Yeah, our law enforcement in Wyoming seems pretty awesome. We've never had trouble getting people to come and attend human trafficking training. So I like them.
And then the cool thing is I get to come back with a new understanding of how to do buyer operations and arrest people wearing
Yes.
my King Rose hat, right? So it doesn't get any better than that.
That's a nice hat, sir. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll talk to you another time.